Katie Mitchell is a storyteller and bookseller. Katie lives, works, and writes in Atlanta, Georgia. Her online and pop-up Black bookstore, Good Books, has been featured in the New York Times, NBC, NPR, VS, and many other outlets. Katie is a Dorothy Porter Wesley Fellow. Prose to the People, a celebration of Black bookstores, is her debut novel, which is set to be published this coming April. Everyone, please help me in welcoming Katie to Georgia Harvest.
Thank you. In Virginia, should free Negroes or their children assemble at a school to learn reading or writing, any justice of the peace may dismiss the school with 20 stripes on the back of every pupil. In Louisiana, the penalty for instructing a free Black in a Sunday school for the first offense, $500. For the second offense, death. No person shall keep or teach any school for instruction of Negroes or mulattoes in reading or writing in this state. Missouri Anti-Literacy Law, 1847. If you teach that nigger, speaking of myself, how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. And that's Frederick Douglass speaking of his master. Good morning, everyone. I'm Katie Mitchell, the author of the forthcoming Prose to the People, a celebration of Black bookstores. Today, we're going to be exploring a crucial yet often overlooked aspect of the civil rights movement, and that is Black-owned bookstores. The right to read is something that we take for granted today, but as the previous slide showed, it was once illegal for Black people in America. And so this presentation, The Right to Read, From Ruggles to Revolution, will highlight two Black bookstores that were crucial in their respective liberation movements. And feel free to hop in and ask questions as they come up, and then I've left plenty of time for questions at the end too. So we'll start our journey with David Ruggles. David Ruggles is known as the father of stateside Black bookstores. He emerged as one of the most influential abolitionists in New York due to his brazen and courageous anti-slavery tactics. His store stood as the hub for anti-slavery publications, some of which he penned himself and even printed in his own print shop on the premises. So in 1835, a year after opening David Ruggles' books, the sanctuary of abolitionist literature was reduced to ashes in a suspected case of arson. And no one took credit for the arson, but he had a lot of enemies. So a lot of people could have done it. He took on efforts to fight against those who were enslaved illegally in New York City. And he exposed these people that were doing this in his New York Slaveholder Directory, which is a publication that unmasked the esteemed white citizens whose servants were in fact kidnapped Black people. So he had been threatened, harassed, assaulted, and yet his commitment to freedom remained steadfast. And in a November 24th, 1835 advertisement in the New York Emancipator, Ruggles stated, "The Friends of Human Rights are respectfully informed that in consequence of the destruction of my books, pamphlets, and stationery by fire, I am compelled for the present to discontinue the sale of the books in the circulating library, but will abide in the same place, continue my agency for all anti-slavery publications." So he was still printing anti-slavery publications in just his own, but he stopped the selling of other books because of the fire and how much he lost. So the same year as the fire, Ruggles continued his abolitionist work. He was the secretary of the New York Committee of Vigilance, which was an integrated group that monitored the Underground Railroad in New York City. And David Ruggles' home was actually one of the main stations in the city. And it's estimated that he assisted hundreds of runaway slaves, the most famous being Frederick Douglass. Douglas wrote of his recollections of meeting Ruggles as I speak of David Ruggles as my old friend. He assisted me, as well as many other fugitive slaves, on the way from slavery to freedom. And a little known fact that I included in Prose of the People is that Frederick Douglass and his first wife were married at the bookstore. So that's not something a lot of people know, but that's where they started their time in New York and were actually married in David Ruggles' bookstore. So Ruggles envisioned a free society and believed books could break slavery's chains. As the father of stateside Black bookstores, Ruggles served as a lighthouse for later booksellers seeking freedom through literacy. David Ruggles and D. Ruggles books mark the genesis of the storied history of Black bookstores in the United States and their key role as sites of Black liberation. And one of the many Black bookstores that carried on the legacy of Ruggles' ethic of liberation through books was Drum and Spear Bookstore in DC. Anybody familiar with Drum and Spear? Spend time in DC? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah,
It came up in my research.
Okay, for sure. Anybody else familiar with Drum and Spear? Heard of it? Okay, you're in for a treat. So Drum and Spear Bookstore was located on 14th Street Northwest and was founded June 1968 by former SNCC activists. Now, let's think back to 1968. What happened a few months before that was a really big deal? Exactly, King's assassination. So the shop was located in the midst of the ruins of the corridor that burned down after Martin Luther King's assassination. And the founders even recounted to me the smell of tear gas lingering in their inventory as they were setting up the shop. So that was the world that the Drum and Spear founders were inhabiting, right? A world of assassinations. And remember, they were activists themselves. They were veterans of SNCC. So the Chicago Daily Defender described Drum and Spear as well-planned and appointed and carried a good stock. A rehabilitation job made it even more attractive and a mecca for seekers of Black literature and ideas. And they talked about one of the managers as the tall young manager Featherstone was remembered for his flashing smile and cool demeanor. He seemed happy, though he was caught up intensely in the swirling tides of the change engulfing the world of the ghetto and beyond. So these were SNCC activists. And as you may know, SNCC was headquartered in Atlanta and the headquarters moved to DC. But these people had spent a lot of time in the South, Lowndes County, Alabama, they were in Mississippi, they were in Georgia, and they had the training to move people into their way of thinking, their way of looking at the world and envisioning a new world. And they took that training and took it and applied it to Drum and Spear. In 1994, Judy Richardson explained Drum and Spear's ethos to Colin Beckles. You can get these folks talking politics and they don't do diddly. So our sense was that was towards some sort of action. And again, using their training as activists to engage the community. What does the community need and how can the bookstore help provide that while also guiding them to a different politic? So Judy describes the store as a think tank for the anti-colonial struggle in Africa and explains that the staff guided customers through their political education. She says it wasn't a dead store. And what she meant by that was that the Drum and Spear staff could see the customers changing and growing as they read. She talked about how they would pick up, Donald Goings, and they didn't really like that, but she would say, here you go, and then the next time they, maybe pick up some Amira Baraka, and you can see their palette changing and going deeper into the books. Daphne Muse, another member of the Drum and Spear staff, said, you had Pookie coming in Drum and Spear, you had ambassadors coming in Drum and Spear, Toni Morrison came in looking for books written by African women specifically. So again, I think that really speaks to the environment that Drum and Spear had. Everyone felt comfortable. It was right down the street from Howard University. So Howard students were coming into Drum and Spear, Howard professors. Sterling A. Brown, was a Howard professor, and he tailored his syllabus to what was available at Drum and Spear. So it was really a motley crew of people who are at Drum and Spear that felt comfortable coming there, and that was my intention. And it really speaks to their training as activists to be able to get the whole community involved. And speaking of the whole community, one big part of the community is our children, right? And Drumming Spear had a really great children's section, which was kind of rare at the time. A lot of the times, bookstores were only adult, or if they did have a children's section, it was kind of an afterthought. But Drumming Spear really focused on children. And in their 1971 catalog, they drove the point home of the importance of children's literature. They wrote, "We found that many of the new books published on the relevant to the Black community bandwagon are either insipid and teach nothing, or are purposely designed to plant negative ideas in the child. We can't overemphasize how important it is that adults carefully read any books which they intend giving to a child. We have found that a book whose title and storyline might seem to be beneficial often masks a kind of racism whose viciousness is even more dangerous because of its subtlety." And so the focus on children in the providing programming through Afro-American Resources, which was the umbrella organization that Drummond Spear fed under, was a tactic borrowed from SNCC. Judy Richardson says, "You bring people in through the services while having a certain politics, but not beating them over the head with it." And so we know it's easy to control a group of people if they feel poorly about themselves, or if they have an inferiority complex, right? And a lot of times that inferiority complex can start in childhood. So that's why Drummond Spear was so careful not to sell books that would contribute to that. But that's not to say that books like that weren't on the market, right? They were widely available other places. So for example, this is a book called Little Brown Cocoa. It's actually a series. And the stories were characterized by stereotypical and problematic depictions of Black people. And the characters, they spoke using poor grammar. They were drawn with exaggerated features. You can see the oversized lips and eyes. And I won't read the whole page, but one line that stuck out to me, which is like, okay, I see what Drummond Spear was saying was, "And Little Brown Cocoa's nice, good, old, big, fat Black mammy tied a clean white apron." So this is an example of what would not be available on Drummond Spear shelves. But in contrast, Drummond Spear published Eloise Greenfield's first children's book called Bubbles, which tells the story of a little Black boy who is excited to be able to read. So this story isn't really political, but it does align with Drummond Spear's ethos of positive Black representation that can encourage customers to think more critically. And if you think about it, folks coming to the store for a book reading, they're bringing their kids to see Eloisa Greenfield. They're getting that positive interaction with the community. And in the store, they're seeing leaflets and flyers for different meetings, different services going on. Drummond Spear had a health clinic. They did food drives. So they were doing a lot of different things. So you're coming in for your kids. They see you as a parent see that this group of people care about children in the community, but then you're getting led down this other path of learning about the civil rights movement and learning about what's going on in the community. So these pictures are from Jennifer Lawson's personal archive, the one in color and the one on top. And then this is the outside of Drummond Spear at one of their locations. Tony Gittins, Drummond Spear's first manager, emphasized the hard work it took to set up the store. As I mentioned, it was during a time of upheaval, like, Holy Week, which was the week that a lot of cities burned after Martin Luther King's assassination. That's when they were setting up the store. And so it took a lot of work to get it up and running, both aesthetically, but also making sure that their SNCC and activist training was present and being felt by the community too. So him and Judy set up the store, built the bookshelves after contractors ran off after only finishing half the job. And Tony, as manager, said he made sure that he always kept the door open, both literally and metaphorically, and that allowed all the community to come in. Jennifer Lawson remembers how small and intimate the space was. She described it as cluttered with books, full of curious neighbors who became regulars, a gathering place. And she was very artistic, and she created a silhouetted map of Africa using tile for Drummond Spear's floor. And she also designed the bookstore's interior. And Judy Richardson called Drummond Spear her second home, where she was surrounded by her people, books, and art. And she recounts the joy, the jazz, and all the political discussions. And so Drummond Spear's unique ability to bring all these people together across class and political leanings to have these discussions threatened the FBI, which added Black extremist bookstores to its counterintelligence program the exact same year that Drummond Spear was opened. And counterintelligence program, you might also have heard it be called COINTELPRO. So one of the scholars who contributed an essay to Prose to the People is Joshua Clark Davis. And he notes that in October 1968, when Hoover wrote the Bureau's 58 field offices ordering investigation on each Black bookstore in their local jurisdictions, he instructed agents to focus on 7 areas of inquiry. Now I want y'all to pay attention to these 7 areas, because I'm gonna ask you a question about them later. The identities of the owners, whether it is a front for any group or foreign interests, whether individuals affiliated with the store engage in extremist activities, the number, type, and source of books and materials on sale, the store's financial condition, its clientele, and whether it's used as a headquarter or meeting place. Does anything stand out to those 7 criteria to you when you're thinking about a bookstore?
Part of it sounds like a public library.
Public library?
I mean, part of it,
Mm-hmm.
part of those criteria.
Right. The thing that stood out most to me was that only 1 of the 7 investigative criteria even pertained to books.
Uh-huh.
So he said the number, the type, and source of books, but everything else was mostly dealing with the people who gathered in the store, and the community that was being forged at these shops, and the coming together around literature and ideas and political writing. I think that is what really troubled him. It really wasn't about books. It was about the community that was being formed around those books. The FBI files indicate that Drummond Spear came onto the Bureau's radar after visits from former SNCC Chairman Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. And being in the same city as the headquarters of the FBI really just made Drummond Spear an unfortunate, easy target. Daphne Muse told me about the trauma of the FBI coming into the store on a regular basis and flipping over the shelves. Tody Gittins states the FBI was after us. He read his FBI file in its entirety twice through and found that they had access to Drummond Spear's bank accounts and all their comings and goings. And he came to this conclusion. I believe that all the Drummond Spear leadership had FBI files. Agents, easily identified by their dark suits and ties, visited the store and tried to make casual conversation with staff while hoping to overhear suspicious comments among customers. There were none. According to their reports, the FBI gained access to our bank account and sought out informants on our activities. So if that's not enough, it wasn't just the federal authorities that were after Drummond Spear. Daphne Muse and Tony Gittins also speak about getting tear gas outside the store by local police and the National Guard. So this is how Daphne Muse remembers it. She says, the day Gwendolyn Brooks came to read, a young, pregnant Black woman had been beaten by the police, and we walked out the store and we saw what was happening. The police came charging at us and threw a tear gas canister, and I fainted in Lerone Bennett's arms. At the time, I was pregnant and didn't know it, and I miscarried, and I'm convinced it's because of the tear gas that I lost that child. And the same day, remembering the same day, Tony Gittins says, a guardsman lifted his gun and shot a canister of tear gas directly at me. The canister missed me and crashed through our glass door, spreading tear gas, which choked us and our customers. A woman fell to the ground. The store was uninhabitable for many days afterwards. It was the closest I've come to being killed. And Miss Muse also had her own FBI agent. I found her FBI file or parts of it at Emory Rose's library. Her agent was named Jim South, and he followed her to and from the store. He even came to her apartment one night asking to talk with him. And when she didn't, he left a note under the door that read, please call the FBI, exchange 73100, extension 765. Thank you, Jim South. And Ms. Muse told me that she hopes that he is still sitting by the phone waiting for that call. And since we're here at the archives, I do have a question for y'all. What organization do you think has the most archival materials related to Black bookstores? Hey. Absolutely. Absolutely. This is also from Joshua Clark Davis's Prose to the People essay. He says, it's not surprising that the FBI was interested in Black bookstores, considering its fixation on African-American literature. As William Maxwell has chronicled, nearly half of the Black modernist authors featured in the second edition of the Norton Anthology of African-American Literature were monitored by J. Edgar Hoover's FBI. As they scrutinized Black authors, scouring their literary output and investigating their political allegiances, agents produced more than 13,000 pages on the leading Black writers of Hoover's lifetime. In Maxwell's reading, the FBI is perhaps the most dedicated and influential forgotten critic of African-American literature. And so that sentiment it goes for Black bookstores too. A lot of the materials that the FBI stole from Black bookstores otherwise wouldn't have survived because it was ephemera. It was flyers for events, letters to each other, and they stole them through a program that they have where they could intercept mail from these activists that they were monitoring. So anyone doing research on Black radical movements will be looking at materials that are narrated by the opposition. So it's important to receive them because they have the most, unfortunately, but it's also important to receive them with skepticism. So on this slide, you'll see materials from the Black Book, which was a bookstore by former Black Panther Party member Paul Coates, and the National Memorial African Bookstore, which was in Harlem, that came onto the Bureau's radar in the 1950s, which was actually before they officially started looking at Black bookstores. And a lot of them are really mundane, like the agents will say nothing to report. There was one instance for Drum and Spear that they were told to go and buy some communist propaganda, but Drum and Spear didn't have it. So they went to the white bookstore called Brentano's and bought it from there and just said they got it from Drum and Spear. But other parts of the archive from the FBI shows the community, the solidarity that was building. And I think that is what most enraged Hoover's FBI. Paul Coates was good friends with another Black Panther member who was locked up. He recently passed away. And you see them talking about him, Eddie Not Guilty, George Jackson movement. The Black Book was focused on helping people on the inside and the outside. So for locked up Panther members, they send them books and have book clubs with them. And then the people on the outside would engage with them as well. So there's a lot of interesting, but again, like I said, mundane things in these archives too, that are interesting that they were so locked in on spying on these folks about cookouts and, just hanging out in the bookstore.
Hoover just was trying to find out about his people.
They do say his mama was Black, so. So do y'all remember the tall, cool bookstore manager with the memorable smile, Ralph Featherstone? Oh, okay, go ahead.
Paul Coates was Ta-Nehisi's dad.
Yeah, he's got Ta-Nehisi's dad, yeah. Paul Coates is, he's still in Baltimore, DC area. He runs Black Classic Press. So Ralph Featherstone was killed the night of March 9th, 1970 by a bomb, along with William Payne while they were driving south on US Route 1, about a half mile from the courthouse in Bel Air where H. Rap Brown was to stand trial. Featherstone was traveling in a direction away from the courthouse at the time of the explosion. Friends say the pair were there to meet Brown and speculated that the blast was also intended to kill H. Rap Brown. So Hoover and Maryland's Governor Mandel reached a conclusion after only 4 days that Featherstone and Payne were killed by their own bomb and that they intended to bomb the courthouse. And they pointed to another explosion that happened at the courthouse the next day to prove that, that they were the ones going to bomb it. And so Black activists disputed this and pointed to a number of discrepancies. One of the biggest ones that the car was going away from the courthouse at the time of the explosion. But no further investigation was ever undertaken, and the two men are regarded as martyrs for the Black liberation movement. So the bookstore ultimately closed in 1974, and Drum and Spear alums cite Featherstone's assassination, intense government surveillance, IRS harassment, debt, and intimidation of customers as the reason the store closed. So to learn more about Drum and Spear and other bookstores that engage in the struggle for civil rights. You can pre-order Prose to the People, a celebration of Black bookstores. This is my first talk about the book, so I appreciate the Georgia Archives and all of you all for coming and listening. One question I've started to field from journalists who've received an early copy of the book is, what is my motivation for writing prose? And I'm reminded of this quote from Frederick Douglass from his third autobiography. He says, my part has been to tell the story of the slave, the story of the master never wanted for narrators. The masters, to tell their story, had at call all the talent and genius and wealth and influence could command. So for my part, I'm writing to tell the story of the descendants of the slave, the people who continue to struggle for the right to read, which is a right that's been wrested from us from our very first days on these shores. And as they're trying to ban history, it's important that we return to it. Archives are subversive. It takes some digging to find these stories, but for Black people, archiving is a revolutionary act because historical truths, they subvert the state's narrative. And there's kinship between the civil liberties that they're trying to take away, the right to assemble, the right to read, the right to protest, and our civil rights. Civil liberties enable our liberation. And they've been attacking the whole project from the very beginning, not just the reading. They attacked the writing, the publishing, the selling, and the archiving. As Mark Oliver noted during an interview with the WPA about his time enslaved, the only book learning we ever got was when we stole it. And Prose to the People wouldn't exist without archives, both institutional and personal. Personal archives created by people who knew the importance of remembering and who also knew that the only way that the history would survive is if they took it. So I think sometimes we forget how powerful books are, but those who have been working for centuries and are currently still doing so, working so that we won't read and won't write and won't know our history, haven't forgotten how powerful these books are. And so if the state is willing to kill, arrest, and bomb these bookstores and bookstore owners so that we might read and might not know, we must ask ourselves, what is in these books? And so these are some of the archives that helped me while I was writing prose. Auburn Ave Research Library and Emory University Rose Library are here in Atlanta. Schaumburg is in Harlem, and they have really good information about National Memorial African Bookstore as well as Frederick Douglass Bookstore. Emory had a lot of information about Drum and Spear. The Daphne Muse collection is at Emory. Also, the Vivian G. Harsh Research Collection is in Chicago. Afro-American Newspaper Archives is in Baltimore, and the UCLA Library Special Collection is in LA. And now I will open it up for questions, and I'll pass my book around for anyone who wants to look through it while we're doing questions.
In your research, I remember I was on YouTube one night and ran across Sonia Sanchez. And she was speaking about, I don't know if she was in California, but her house was raided and she was arrested because some of the literature that she had in her house that was considered, they weren't supposed to own, could not read. And I was like, wow. Some people, they try to take their books or took their books and was told that if they were found with the books, they would be arrested.
Yeah, and it definitely goes against what we were told about, our freedom of speech. I know Sonia Sanchez did a lot with Black Studies departments in California. So I think that might have been when she was in California.
It was terrible. I think her, even the guy you mentioned.
Mary?
Yes, I believe him too. Yeah.
Yes.
They were really, threatened with their, she might have been arrested because they came to her house and found some books. But it was some books that, was considered a threat by Hoover the monster. Yeah.
Yeah, I think when these books, they know how powerful they are and how much truth is in them. So they don't want us to read them.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Malcolm X and the bookstore that he liked to go to in New York.
Yeah, so Malcolm X's home bookstore was called National Memorial African Bookstore, and that was in Harlem. It was owned by Louis Michaud. And Louis Michel, he was a character. He's in the book. He was one of my favorite people to read about because his store was around for like 40 years. So it's a lot of archival information. He was always in the news protesting. Malcolm X was always there. He nicknamed the spot outside of his store where Malcolm X would speak, Harlem Square. So people would do like large rallies and talk about, going back to Africa. He said he was the unofficial headquarters of Garvey's Back to Africa movement. So yeah, Malcolm spent a lot of time at that bookstore, and a lot of activists did. And I think that is why National Memorial African Bookstore was on the FBI's list so early, because they saw the people coming together there and they saw Malcolm there. And so he was being surveilled before a lot of these bookstores. Did you have a?
Just comment more than a question. I just was excited when I saw you doing the talk on the schedule because your work overlaps so much with what I was studying for mine. So at a point, the ladies who I wrote about, a lot of their work was around literacy, right? So the bookstores that you're talking about, when you get into the Black Power movement, ones like Drum and Spear, would be important for them in doing their work, because in order to keep the children and teach them in a responsible way, a culturally competent way, they had to have the right literature.
Right.
So Amina Baraka talked about, them having to create the literature at first, but it being nice when they could get their hands on literature, and Black bookstores were important places to get the kind of literature that you showed there. Especially when they started schools like African Free School in Newark. And then Joshua Clark Davis's work was important. I was relying on his before the book came out. And then did you come across Maisha Fisher's work? She's talking about Black bookstores as literacy hubs.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so I got into that, and then places to earn dual degrees.
Yeah.
Because of, like a lot of the women I talked about were saying, they read Carter G. Woodson, Miseducation of the Negro. So if you're being miseducated or diseducated within a standard educational system, it was important to have these books in bookstores, to set up bookstores as literacy hubs. So people in organizations and in the neighborhood could come, like you're saying, and learn about themselves, learn about things that would re-educate them. And then when they talked about it, I could hear it was all about Kazi and the principles of Blackness for them. And one woman even had made up a song where she said, Carter G. Woodson ultimately taught that education didn't mean a degree. Education meant how you help the race and all of humanity. And you learn this in literacy hubs, like in Black bookstores. Yeah, so I had to take that detour. That's how I learned about Drum and Spear, even though none of them that I know about, I've worked with Drum and Spear. Almost all of the women worked in a bookstore, or started a bookstore, donated books to a bookstore, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you reminded me that a lot of the bookstores during the Black Power movement had their own print shops as well. And we've seen that kind of fall off with the more modern bookstores now. But so there's a bookstore called Marcus in Oakland. The Black Book had its own print shop. Drum and Spear had its own press. So I think that goes back to being able to have control of the narrative. And a lot of times the big publishers wouldn't want to tell the truth about Black history. So they took it into their own hands and printed their own pamphlets and books. And a lot of them are still available, like out of print, but available. So yeah, and Marcus Books is still open in Oakland if y'all ever find yourself on the West Coast.
You mentioned you have your own.
Mhm.
Did you ever get into like the more like mobile bookstores? Because I know it reminds me of the question that's woman here mentioned earlier of like in the South, in the rural South, like you don't have as many like, I guess, bookstores or Black-owned bookstores. So
Right.
were there means of like mobile bookstores or like even like the library initiating things like that?
Yeah, so there are definitely a lot of mobile libraries that I came across. I kept it more in the bookstore realm and more in the brick and mortar realm. But the thing that I love about the research that I did is that it's building upon a lot of research about Black bookstores. So I'm excited to read the next iteration where people are talking about the different ways people set up places for literacy. So mobile bookstores, different library initiatives. Even now, a lot of people are doing stuff around social media, and I think that's a really interesting, call back to those mobile bookstores. So I didn't really get deep into that, but I am looking forward to seeing that come out soon. Mhm.
Do you know anything about the anti-literacy laws in Georgia?
They're all very similar. Yeah, like if you are caught teaching a Black person how to read, and even we go back to the first one, I thought the amounts are very interesting. It's like $500 and then death. But and this is in the 1800s, so I haven't done the calculation, but that's a lot of money now. So I'm like, how much was $500 back then? But yeah, they're all pretty similar, especially in the South. But even you'll find like, some people don't really think Virginia is like the deep South, but they have those laws all around. But yeah, Georgia had similar laws on the books as well.
I understand that you have a bookstore yourself.
Yeah, it's a pop-up, an online bookstore called Good Books. I don't really talk about it in Post to the People. I focus on like the brick and mortar bookstores, but yes, I do.
Because I wondered about like, bookstores and independent.
My thoughts on them. I think some of them are following in the tradition of Drum and Spear, focusing on liberation. And then there were other bookstores in that time period that were just more capitalist ventures. And I do make the distinction in Post to the People of a Black bookstore versus a Black owned bookstore, which Paul Coates helped me come to that distinction. So in my writing, a Black bookstore focuses on Black literature and is mission driven. And then a Black owned bookstore, which there are plenty, they have books by, all types of people, and maybe they don't really have a focus on liberation, but just like a focus on literacy, which is still a good thing. But yeah, that's one of the things that you'll find in the introduction.
Because, some years, fairly recently, everybody was feeling very pessimistic about any kind of independent bookstore.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm hearing that there is sort of a renaissance.
Oh, definitely.
And you're seeing that.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I don't think they're gonna be going away. I mean, individual independent bookstores come and go, but I think the concept of independent bookstores are here to stay. Did you have a question, Lorraine?
Yeah, kind of a question, John. I found that, okay. How do you think it's a big problem? I think it's a big problem with the social media and disinformation, as opposed, you were saying like when the Black bookstores, Drum and Spear started, it was a way for people to get out a message. This is what you are, not over here with the non-teaching or whatever. And I fear a large problem with disinformation that is used on the internet. Whereas now, even the big bookstores, there are a lot of them that are closing. So we know if they have a hard time staying open, a smaller bookstore is going to have a hard time staying open. But I just think that, most people who, let's say back in the day, they wrote books, then that information was something that they had went out there and they researched. Whereas now with social media, you can take a fact and spin it any way you want to. And I think that has discouraged, or say younger people or people who may not know things about a history, to take that word that's on social media, which can be further from the truth. And I'll say this, I actually spoke to some young people who take, politics, were taking some facts that with the Republican Party that, they actually freed, the Republican Party freed the slaves. So it must not, they were taking disinformation and spinning it the way they want. So I fear that people are going more toward social media facts as opposed to book facts. Do you think that is so, or just never? I fear that we are getting away from books that may tell facts as opposed to social media that can be very easily manipulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is part of the time that we're living in, especially with AI coming to the forefront. But I do think these bookstores are fighting back in that regard, and they too are on social media. So there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation on social media, but there is a lot of real and true things there too. And I found that people will engage with both. And the bookstores, and there's a lot of independent archivists giving really good information on Instagram and TikTok. But I think as individuals and as people who could help the younger people kind of parse through what is real and what isn't real. And yes, the Republican Party did, free the slaves, but let's go deeper and talk about what that means and how this Republican Party is different from that Republican Party, which could be found online or in a book. But yeah, just making it accessible and like going past that just one little soundbite fact.
Could you say a little bit about the March on Washington bookstore?
Yeah. So there was a bookstore in DC around the 1940s called The March. No, it was actually in New York, I believe. It was in Harlem. It was called The March. And so everyone knows like the March on Washington of the 60s, but there was another March on Washington in the 40s. And the bookstore came about because it was like fundraising for the March organization, which was a conglomerate of civil rights organizations. And so it was around for, I believe, like 11 years, but it kind of paid the bills for the organization for a while. And then the conglomerate disbanded and the March bookstore stayed open. So I think it is a really good example of movements and bookstores going hand in hand. So kind of like a precursor to Drum and Spear with the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. But yeah, that one is also in the book in like the Northeast section, if you want to read more about that. Any more questions? Yeah.
You have books for sale today?
No, so the book comes out April 8th. So it is available for pre-order. If you scan that QR code in the flyer that I handed out, you can pre-order it. And this is top secret, never been heard before. But if you pre-order it, you'll get a little pin as a thank you gift for pre-ordering it. So if you pre-order it before, April 7th, you'll get a little like thank you from the publisher for pre-ordering it. So hot off the presses, haven't told Instagram that yet. So keep it between us. Thank y'all.